A few months ago, I did a video on my top 10 favourite punk albums. And I did it on the back of my first one, which was on Genesis, from worst to best, Bruce Springsteen, worst to best, and I can't remember whether I did the punk one before or after. I also did my favourite top 10 Van Morrison albums. And but basically, I'm not. I would never describe myself as like a really dedicated punk fan, but it was one of the genres of music that I really enjoyed when I was young, when it was punk was coming out in the UK, 76, 77, and 78. And I wanted to kind of give some recognition to a few of my favourite albums in that genre. Most notably, The Crack by The Ruts. Now, I didn't set out to do an accurate history of punk. I can't possibly claim to be such an expert in punk that I can give you the whole history from garage music back in the late 60s through to the early, MC5 and Iggy and the Stooges, New York Dolls, and the New York scene, and so on and so forth. That all preceded the advent of punk in the UK. I can't possibly claim to give the definitive history. But what I did do is talk about some of my favourite artists of the period. So obviously there was the Ruts, as I've mentioned, the Clash, the Stranglers, the Damned, the Police. Heresy, not punk, are they? But and I didn't really kind of, as I say, major on some of the artists that were coming out of New York in particular, like Patti Smith, Television, Richard Hell, and the Voidoids. I guess what I'm saying is that some of the bands that I kind of named in my top 10 weren't what real punk aficionados call authentic punk. So I got a lot of comments on the videos, on the video itself. Most people saying, why didn't you mention Sham 69, Penetration, Television, Wire, Patti Smith, the Saints, the Undertones, Stiff Little Fingers, the Buzzcocks, and many others really. But the biggest omission apparently that I made was for the Ramones. So I was never really such a dedicated fan of punk. I mean, I picked up on punk through the charts, through John Peel's radio show, picking up singles really, tuning into some of these new emerging bands. But one thing I didn't do is I didn't throw myself into punk with this idea that I'm going to wear it as a badge of honor. I'm going to start wearing the garb, the fancy hairstyles, and so on and so forth. I liked all sorts of music. I really was interested, and I retained an interest in rock music and progressive rock and some pop and classical music, because I was into classical music from the mid-70s onwards. And so punk just came along. It was just another genre. So it's certainly I certainly enjoyed the music, but didn't go in for the wardrobe changes and the wardrobe innovation, shall we say. My perspective on punk was both UK centric and provincial. So I was living up in Newcastle in the northeast of England. We're on the gig circuit. But most of the action, so we got to see some of the punk bands as they came through, most of which I've already mentioned, and I saw almost all of them during that period. But the big punk scene and the big influencers and drivers were not surprisingly based in London, as were the music press. So that's where all the stuff was being written about. That's where the New York connections were strongest, not in the northeast of England. So one of the So one of the things that the music journalists used to talk about was what was going on in CBGBs in Manhattan, and they kept talking about these bands and writing up about these American bands like I've mentioned, Television, Blondie, and of course the Ramones. And when I kind of acknowledge the Ramones as an important band in pop music, someone recently pointed out that they really did tour the UK, I think on a couple of occasions, and recorded a live album in London, in the Rainbow. And it just passed me by. It just passed me by. So for me, I'm trying to rack my brains as to why I've got this blind spot for the Ramones, why they never really registered, despite the fact that I've got a few of their albums now. And I think the thing that really meant a lot to me in terms of punk music, and what was really, really different to rock music that preceded it or was being played alongside it, was that the front men in the punk bands, the ones that really registered with me, they had one thing in common, and that is that they were angry. It might be just a persona. I mean, when you look at John Lydon, I think there's a case to be made that he was always a bit of a pantomime, cartoonish figure. Awesome frontman, though he was. But there was, when I think about the punk bands that were led by the likes of, Jimmy Percy, Sham 69, Malcolm Owen from the Ruts, Hugh Cornwell and Jean-Jacques Burnel from the Stranglers, Sting from the Police. Sting's a bit of a hard nut. I've seen him jump out of off stage into the crowd and beat up somebody for spitting at the stage. And Paul Weller, another inauthentic punk, but channeled that anger as the angry young man into his lyrics and his stage presence. So it was, and of course Joe Strummer from the Clash. Although Joe was, of course, famously a middle-class boy, privately educated, I understand. But the whole ethos of the Clash was real aggression. So aggression was definitely there. So when I think about these bands and what the gigs were like, very different from sitting quietly listening to the quiet sections of, say, Supper's Ready by Genesis. It just was a completely different experience. So you're in what these days, or they've called for a long time, the mosh pit. You're right up in front of the stage. The crowd would be swaying back and forward. There'd be punches thrown. There'd certainly be spitting going on. And you kind of came out of these gigs, sweating from head to toe, needing a shower, needing to get your clothes in the wash and all that sort of stuff. So it was really a very angry, super energetic concert experience. So when I think, there was an element of danger to it as well, and you'd come out with some bruises occasionally. And when I think about the bands that came out of the United States, and obviously the danger component was a feature of Iggy Pop's stage persona. There's no doubt about that. But the other bands that came out of CBGBs, the ones that crossed the Atlantic, didn't seem to have that anger. And I think it's something about when I think about those bands, including the Ramones, I see more of an influence of, say, kind of surf music and pop music. Sure, they can play fast, and the Ramones famously played fast, only mellowing out a little bit late after the first maybe 3 albums. But they were it's kind of polished pop music, and of course Blondie. Of course, even I was just listening the other day to the first Blondie album, which real punk aficionados saying, "Oh, that's in the genre as well," but it's a pop album, and there's a few fast-ish tracks, but there's some real pop music on there as well. And Richard Hell or Blank Generation, there was Suicide, of course, the Duo, again from New York. But I'm just searching. I'm trying to search the equivalent of real danger and real anger, and it just didn't seem to be the thing that really resonated with me at the time. And even now, when I look back, and I think I just can't put my hand on my heart and say that these bands were genuine punk. I think one of the things that I would say about the and maybe it's a case of the cream, the competition, and the cream rising to the top. The bands that we heard from East Coast United States, New York in particular, were just ultra professional. Sure, they were very different, but these were good bands who could play instruments competently, and you know picked up the ethos of playing fast and energetically, and then they became internationally famous. So by the time they got here, they were already polished, rather than really at the rough edges of punk. So when I think of my experience of punk and my appreciation of it, I would classify the bands coming out of the United States and including the Ramones more of a new wave band, where that punk ethos of simple arrangements, playing fast, with that energy, as I've mentioned, that kind of punk morphed into new wave and made space for Magazine, early Cure, Elvis Costello, and any number of new wave bands which had several years of fantastic creativity and great bands coming through. I think there's a lot of. I think I'd also add that I think there's a lot of revisionism when it comes to punk. This old canard that punk was a reaction to progressive rock, which, if you remember at the time, those of you who were in the UK, progressive rock was dying on its arse basically. There's only a few bands were left, ploughing a furrow. Genesis, Pink Floyd, Yes. And not many others, because their heyday was really in the early mid 1970s. And and my contention was that punk was it was a single based genre rather than albums, and it was more of a reaction to how poor the charts were at the time. There was lots of novelty singles kicking around in 75, 76, and so on, and it was a very, very tired music scene. And sure, there were some bands that had been around for a long time. Electric Light Orchestra were still making decent singles at the time, but they'd been around. Jeff Lynne had been around for a very long time, and I don't want to pick on him because what he did was really, really good. But there was lots of novelty tunes: Birdie Song, The Rubettes, Bay City Rollers, although that was a bit earlier. Brotherhood of Man. All these really mediocre bands. So in the end, punk, just like any other music genre, attracts purists. I mean, heavy metal music, progressive rock, they've got their purists as well. And I think when when people are really committed to a particular genre and they really identify with it. Their friends are punk fans. They dress in a similar fashion, and I think there's a tendency to broaden the open up the tent to more and more participants, more and more visitors, and so that's where you see the likes of the second Elvis Costello album, which is kind of a punk album in terms of ethos, but it ain't a punk album. Elvis Costello was never really a punk artist. But that's purist for you. That's the way it is. So, have I got a blind spot when it comes to the Ramones? Well, yes and no. I think I've got good reasons for singling out particular bands that I consider to be punk, and I would see the Ramones as, although you'd pick up a book on the history of punk and the Ramones would certainly be there, probably chapter 1, didn't really register as a punk band to me, more of a pop band, new wave band. So there you have it. So just some thoughts on the punk scene and why my particular enjoyment of punk is, and it was when I made the video as well, it was deliberately narrowed down to a small number of bands and a small number of albums that really meant, really had an impact on me. So there you go. That's my excuses for not being a huge fan of the Ramones. Hey ho. See you on the next one.